The year is 1858. The place is London, a sprawling metropolis choking on its own progress. Imagine, if you will, the city not as a collection of grand palaces and bustling markets, but as a living organism, a monstrous entity of brick, stone, and humanity. And like any organism, it had to deal with its waste. This is not the romanticized London of Dickensian novels, nor the gaslit streets of Sherlock Holmes. This is the London of filth, a city drowning in its own refuse. For the average Victorian Londoner, life was a constant, low-grade battle against the invisible and the malodorous. The air itself was a thick, palpable presence, a cocktail of coal smoke, industrial fumes, and the overwhelming scent of human waste. This scent, a constant companion in the humid summer months, was more than just unpleasant. It was a harbinger of death. It was the smell of the great stink. To understand the great stink and the ingenious, if somewhat unglamorous solution that followed, you must first understand the state of sanitation in mid-19th century London. The city's population had exploded, reaching over 2.5 million people by 1850, yet its infrastructure, particularly its drainage system, was still rooted in a medieval design. The River Thames, once the city's lifeline, had become its main sewer. The concept of a modern sealed sewer system was still in its infancy. Most homes had what were known as cesspits, essentially large underground pits for collecting human waste. These were often located in basements or backyards, and while they were a step up from simply throwing waste into the street, they were a ticking time bomb of disease. As the city grew, so did the cesspits. They would fill up, and the job of emptying them fell to a profession known as the night soil men. These men, working under the cover of darkness to avoid the public's disgust, would shovel the waste into carts and haul it away. It was a grim, thankless job, and it was also woefully inadequate for a city of London's size. The overflow from these cesspits seeped into the ground, contaminating the shallow wells that many Londoners still relied on for drinking water. But an even more significant problem was the direct connection between these cesspits and the city's storm drains. These storm drains, designed to carry rainwater into the Thames, were increasingly used as a convenient, if illegal, way to dispose of household waste. The introduction of the flushing toilet, a marvel of modern convenience, only compounded the problem. Invented by Sir John Harrington in the late 16th century, and later improved upon by Alexander Cumming and Joseph Bramah, the flushing toilet began to gain popularity in the mid-1800s. It was a symbol of progress and cleanliness, but it was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Each flush sent a deluge of waste directly into the already overtaxed storm drains, which in turn emptied into the Thames. The result was a river that was less a body of water and more a flowing cesspool. The summer of 1858 was a particularly hot one, a sweltering season that baked the city under a relentless sun. The heat, combined with the low water level in the river, caused the raw sewage. Parliament, situated right on the banks of the Thames, was directly impacted. The smell was so potent that members of Parliament couldn't bear to sit in their chambers. Curtains were soaked in a concoction of carbolic acid and lime to try and mask the stench, but it was a futile effort. The great stink had arrived. This was not a mere inconvenience. It was a public health crisis. The prevailing theory of disease at the time was the miasma theory, which posited that diseases like cholera and typhus were spread by bad air or miasmas, the very gases that were now emanating from the river. While we now know that diseases are caused by germs and bacteria, the belief in miasma theory was so strong that it provided a powerful impetus for action. The sight and smell of the Thames, a river so thick with waste that it was described as a soup, were proof enough for the Victorian public that their very air was poisoned, and so the stage was set for one of the most significant, yet least celebrated, public works projects in human history. It was a project that would require immense political will, a revolutionary engineering vision, and a massive investment of public funds. But who would be the man to lead this Herculean effort? And how would he convince a conservative government and a skeptical public that the solution to their problems lay not in the air above them, but in the ground beneath their feet? The man who would be tasked with this monumental challenge was Joseph Bazalgette. Bazalgette was not a politician, nor was he a public figure of great renown. He was, quite simply, a brilliant engineer. He had a deep understanding of hydraulics and a keen eye for logistics, but most importantly, he had a vision that went against the grain of prevailing thought. While others were debating how to purify the air, Bazalgette knew the true enemy was not miasma, but the very waste that created it. He saw the problem not as a matter of smell, but as a matter of flow. The solution, as he envisioned it, was audacious, an entirely new, sealed sewer system. It would not simply be a series of pipes, but an intricate network of underground tunnels, intercepting the old storm drains and rerouting all of London's waste away from the Thames. This waste would be carried by gravity, flowing through massive, brick-lined conduits, all the way to a new outfall site far downstream, where it could be treated and safely discharged into the sea. The plan was revolutionary, but it came with an astronomical price tag. In today's terms, the cost would be in the billions. Gaining political and public support for such a project would be a slow and painstaking process. Bazalgette's plan was not simply a single, grand design. It was a symphony of engineering, a masterclass in detail and foresight. He planned for not one, but two main sewer systems, one on the north bank of the Thames and one on the south. On the north bank, his system was a marvel of subterranean construction. It was so vast that it required the creation of three main interceptor sewers: the high level, the middle level, and the low level. These would all converge at Abbey Mills pumping station, a magnificent architectural feat in itself, often referred to as the Cathedral of Sewage. This station would lift the sewage from the low-lying areas of London up into the main outflow pipe. From there, it would flow by gravity for another 5 miles to the outfall works at Beckton on the south bank. A similar, though slightly less complex, system was built, with its own pumping station at Crossness. These pumping stations were not simply functional. They were designed with a sense of Victorian grandeur, their ironwork and brick arches, a testament to the era's belief that even the most mundane of public works deserved a touch of artistry. They were powered by massive steam engines, the largest of their kind, a testament to the industrial might of the British Empire. The construction of this immense network was a project of unparalleled scale. It involved digging 82 miles of main sewer lines and a staggering 1,100 miles of smaller, street-level sewers. It was a Herculean task carried out by thousands of laborers working in treacherous conditions. They faced cave-ins, explosions from methane gas, and the ever-present risk of disease. The work was slow, dangerous, and incredibly expensive. The public, while desperate for a solution to the Great Stink, were often skeptical of the cost and the sheer ambition of the plan. But Bazalgette was a man who understood the long game. He designed the sewers with a remarkable eye for the future, building them far larger than was necessary for the London of his day. His reasoning was simple. "We are only going to do this once," he is reported to have said. He calculated for a city double its current size, a foresight that would prove to be invaluable in the decades that followed. This decision, seemingly a waste of public funds at the time, is the reason that London's Victorian sewer system, with some modern updates, continues to function effectively today, over 160 years later. However, the story of the London sewers is not just a tale of engineering triumph. It's also a story of a silent revolution in public health. While the sewer system was being built, another man, a physician named John Snow, was busy proving Bazalgette's premise correct. Snow, a pioneer of epidemiology, used a map of London to meticulously track a cholera outbreak in 1854. He demonstrated that the source of the outbreak was a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work was a death blow to the miasma theory, proving that disease was waterborne, not airborne. But despite Snow's groundbreaking work, the miasma theory remained the dominant belief for many years. It was the visceral experience of the Great Stink, not the scientific evidence of John Snow, that finally moved Parliament to act. And so, as the sewers were being built, a new era of public health was being born. The massive underground tunnels and pumping stations were not just for carrying away waste. They were the physical manifestation of a profound shift in understanding. They were the key to unlocking the urban environment and making it a place where millions could live, work, and thrive without constant fear of disease. The sewers became the silent, unseen foundation of modern London. But what would be the ultimate fate of this massive, multi-million-pound project? How would it change the city and the lives of its inhabitants for generations to come? And what lessons did it offer for other burgeoning cities around the world? The completion of London's new sewer system was a slow but steady triumph. The first main pumping station at Crossness was officially opened by the Prince of Wales in 1865, a grand ceremony marking the beginning of the end for the city's foul rivers. The entire project was largely completed by 1875, a testament to the immense will and effort that went into it. The impact was immediate and profound, even if it was largely invisible to the average Londoner. The once putrid Thames began to clear. The Great Stink was relegated to a bad memory, and the constant threat of waterborne diseases like cholera and typhus receded. Bazalgette's legacy was a city transformed. The new sewers, with their deep underground tunnels, provided a foundation, not just for sanitation, but for a new kind of urban life. The once lethal combination of dense population and open cesspools was broken. The sewers allowed for the city's continued growth, enabling London to become the truly global hub it is today. His foresight in building the system larger than was needed for his time proved to be one of the most significant engineering decisions in history. while other cities would struggle with outbreaks of disease for decades to come. London had, for the most part, solved its most fundamental public health crisis. The story of the London sewers is, in a way, a perfect metaphor for the Victorian era itself. It was a time of grand ideas and massive ambition, but also of a deep understanding of the practical, if unglamorous needs of a burgeoning society. The sewers were not a flashy monument like the Crystal Palace or the Houses of Parliament. They were a hidden, functional masterpiece. They were the essential plumbing of a modern world being built from scratch. This project also highlights the triumph of engineering over ideology. While the public and politicians were caught up in the miasma theory, it was a practical, down-to-earth engineer who understood the true problem and provided the correct solution, even if the reasoning behind it wasn't yet fully accepted. The success of the London sewers was not a one-off event. It became a blueprint for cities around the world, from Paris to New York, demonstrating that large-scale public works projects could be a powerful tool for improving public health and quality of life. The story of the sewers is a quiet victory, a testament to the fact that progress is often found not in the grand pronouncements or the heroic battles, but in the meticulous, painstaking work of people like Joseph Bazalgette. So, as you walk the streets of a modern city, or simply flush a toilet, consider the invisible network that keeps the system running. It is a legacy of the Victorian era, a time when a group of determined individuals looked at a city drowning in its own waste and decided to build something new, something that would, in its own quiet way, change the world forever. The Great Stink may be a forgotten piece of history, but its solution remains a vital and unseen part of our daily lives, a silent guardian of our health and a monument to human ingenuity. The year is 1845. The place is County Mayo, Ireland. The air, typically moist and mild, feels heavy with a strange sense of foreboding. For the tenant farmers of this region, and indeed for millions across the island, life revolved around a single, unassuming tuber, the potato. It was more than just a food. It was the bedrock of their existence. A single acre of land could produce enough potatoes to feed a family for an entire year. It was a caloric miracle, a crop so efficient and so nourishing that it had enabled the Irish population to explode from just over 3 million in the late 1700s to more than 8 million by the 1840s. The potato, along with some buttermilk, provided almost all the necessary nutrients for a hard day's labor. But reliance on a single food source, no matter how reliable it seemed, was a precarious gamble. The warning signs were subtle at first, barely a whisper on the wind. Small, black spots began to appear on the leaves of the potato plants, a fungal blight that seemed to come from nowhere. It spread with terrifying speed, a silent and invisible enemy. It was a disease that would come to be known as Phytophthora infestans, or the potato blight. The farmers watched in horror as their once vibrant fields, a sea of green and purple flowers, turned to black, rotting mush. The crop, their very means of survival, was turning into a foul-smelling, inedible slurry in the ground. This was not a singular event, but the beginning of a long and agonizing descent into starvation, a period of history known as the Great Famine. While the blight was the trigger, the famine's roots lay deep within the complex and often brutal social and political structure of 19th century Ireland. For centuries, the island had been under British rule. The majority of the land was owned by a small class of Anglo-Irish landlords, many of whom were absentee, living in England and collecting rents from their impoverished tenants. The tenants, in turn, were often on small plots of land, entirely dependent on a single crop. There was a surplus of grain and other foodstuffs grown in Ireland, but this was primarily for export to Britain. The Irish people, in their dire need, had little to no access to this food. The economic system was one of profound and ingrained inequality, a system that would turn a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. It is here, in the midst of this unfolding tragedy, that we find our forgotten hero, a man who, in his own small way, tried to stand against the tide. His name was Colonel Dennis Mahon, a landlord in County Roscommon. Unlike many of his peers, Mahon was an improving landlord. He had a reputation for being somewhat progressive, investing in agricultural improvements, and generally trying to manage his estate responsibly. He was not a man of great political power, but he had a sense of duty to his tenants, a sense that was, tragically, far from universal among the landed gentry of the time. As the blight took hold, Mahon saw the devastation firsthand. He recognized the profound danger his tenants were in and took immediate action. He opened a soup kitchen on his estate, providing food for hundreds of his starving tenants. He used his own money to buy Indian corn, a new and unfamiliar food to the Irish, and distributed it. He even went so far as to waive rents for his most desperate tenants, a decision that put him at odds with the other landlords and with the accepted economic wisdom of the time. He believed that the moral imperative of saving lives outweighed the economic principle of rent collection, but Mahon's actions, while heroic, were a drop in the ocean of suffering. The scale of the famine was simply too vast for any one person to solve. The government in London, under Prime Minister Robert Peel, did make some efforts, primarily importing and distributing Indian corn. But these efforts were often hampered by bureaucracy, slow to arrive, and woefully insufficient for the millions in need. The prevailing economic ideology of the time, known as laissez-faire, argued that the government should not interfere in the market. Many believed that the famine was a kind of natural correction, a divine punishment, and that intervening would only worsen the problem in the long run. In this atmosphere of political apathy and widespread starvation, Colonel Mahon's actions made him both a beacon of hope and a target of resentment. The very tenants he was trying to save were caught between desperation and a deep-seated anger at a system that had failed them. The land agents, the middlemen who collected rents for the landlords, became a symbol of this oppression. Mahon, with his good intentions, was an anomaly. His actions, so contrary to the norms of the time, would put him on a collision course with a growing movement of radicalized tenants and a secret society known as the RIBBONMEN. So, as the famine deepened and the cries of the starving grew louder, Mahon's small acts of charity were viewed by some not as a solution, but as an act of treason against his class. He was seen as a man who had sided with the enemy, and as a man of principle, he would soon be faced with an impossible choice. How could he, a solitary landlord, save his tenants in a entire system was designed to do the opposite? And what would happen to a man who, in the middle of a disaster, chose to put humanity before profit? Colonel Dennis Mahon's efforts, while noble, were met with an increasingly hostile political climate. His decision to forgive rents and distribute aid directly to his tenants was a radical act in a society built on the strict adherence to property rights. The British government's policy of non-intervention, influenced by the dominant economic theory of laissez-faire, created a vacuum of responsibility. They believed that the market and private charity would eventually correct the problem. This belief was not just an economic one. It was also tinged with a deep-seated anti-rich sentiment. Many in the British establishment saw the famine not as a tragedy to be averted, but as a kind of moral failing on the part of the Irish people, a consequence of their supposed laziness and overpopulation. This callous indifference from the British government left the Irish people with no one to turn to. As the famine worsened, the people's quiet desperation turned into a simmering rage. The landlords, who continued to collect rents even as their tenants starved, became the face of this oppression. While many landlords, like Mahone, were struggling themselves and were unable to provide much in the way of relief, a significant number of them were using the famine as an opportunity. They were evicting tenants who couldn't pay their rents, often razing their homes to prevent them from returning. This process, known as clearances, was a brutal and inhumane way to consolidate land and make way for more profitable livestock farming. Mahone's compassionate approach stood in stark contrast to these brutal tactics. His generosity was interpreted by some of his more radical tenants as a sign of weakness. A secret society known as the Ribbonmen, a militant organization dedicated to protecting tenant farmers and retaliating against landlords and their agents, saw Mahon as a potential ally, a man who could be swayed to their cause. They began to exert pressure on him, demanding he do more, even as he was running out of resources. Their demands escalated to threats, and Mahon, who was a man of principle but also a realist, began to fear for his life. The situation came to a head in the summer of 1847. The second and third years of the famine had been particularly brutal, with mass starvation, disease, and emigration. The relief efforts, both public and private, were a disorganized mess. Mahon, in a final attempt to help his tenants, organized a massive emigration scheme. He paid for the passage of hundreds of his tenants to Canada, a seemingly humanitarian act. But these coffin ships, as they came to be known, were often little more than floating death traps. Packed with sick and starving passengers, they were breeding grounds for diseases like typhus. Many of the emigrants died on the journey, and the ones who survived were often in a state of advanced illness. The news of these deaths, as it trickled back to Ireland, was twisted and distorted. The emigration scheme, which Mahon had organized with the best of intentions, was seen by some as a ruthless act of ethnic cleansing, a way for him to rid himself of his starving tenants. The Ribbonmen and other radical groups seized upon this narrative. They branded Mahon as a murderer, a man who had feigned compassion only to betray his own people. The fact that he was one of the few landlords who had actually tried to help was lost in the furious rhetoric. The stage was set for a tragedy. On a cold November evening in 1847, as Mahon was riding in his carriage near his estate, a group of armed men ambushed him. They shot him dead on the side of a lonely road. His assassination sent shockwaves through the country. It was the first high-profile murder of a landlord during the famine, and it marked a turning point. It was a clear signal that the time for passive resistance was over, and that the anger of the starving populace had reached a violent crescendo. Mahone's murder was a stark and brutal illustration of the impossible position he was in. He was a man caught between two worlds, unable to fully align with either. He was a landlord, but his actions were seen as a betrayal of his class. He was a benefactor to his tenants, but his relief efforts were seen as a failure, a final act of cruelty. His story is a poignant one, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned acts can have unintended and tragic consequences in a time of widespread despair and political dysfunction. The death of the Potato King, as some had mockingly called him, was a dark stain on an already bleak chapter of history. It was a final, devastating act in a period defined by suffering. But what was the long-term impact of his death? Did it lead to more violence, or did it serve as a wake-up call? And what does his tragic tale tell us about the nature of charity and the limits of individual action in the face of systemic failure? The assassination of Colonel Dennis Mahon sent a powerful and terrifying message across Ireland. It was not a message of hope, but of a new and brutal reality. His murder, rather than inspiring more acts of charity, instilled fear in the hearts of other landlords. Many of them, already struggling with their own finances, saw Mahone's fate as a clear warning. Charity, in the eyes of the most radicalized tenant groups, was not enough. It was an end to the era of tentative and often insufficient humanitarianism and the beginning of a period of heightened violence. The Land War, a period of agrarian conflict that would last for decades, had found one of its first martyrs. Mahone's death also had a significant political impact. It gave the British government an excuse to take a harder line on Ireland, rather than viewing the assassination as a symptom of a much larger problem. They saw it as a criminal act of terrorism that needed to be put down with force. This hardening of attitudes further entrenched the divide between the Irish people and their British rulers, leading to a cycle of violence and repression. The hopes of a peaceful, cooperative solution to the famine were dashed, replaced by a bitter, long-lasting conflict. The story of Colonel Dennis Mahon, the Potato King who tried to save his people, serves as a poignant and often overlooked cautionary tale. It shows us the limits of individual action in the face of systemic failure. Mahone was a man of good intentions, operating within a broken system. He was a kind landlord in a world of cruel ones, a man of charity in a time of radicalized desperation. His efforts, while extraordinary for their time, were simply not enough to counteract centuries of oppression, economic inequality, and political apathy. In this way, Mahone's story is a microcosm of the entire famine. The Great Famine was not a natural disaster in the traditional sense. It was a societal failure, a human-made tragedy in which the blight was merely the catalyst. The blight may have been what caused the potatoes to rot, but it was the prevailing political and economic systems that allowed millions to starve. The British government's reliance on laissez-faire economics, the power of absentee landlords, and a deep-seated anti-Irish bias all conspired to create a situation where a simple crop failure could lead to 1 million deaths and 1 million more. Mahone's tragic end is a somber reflection on the nature of history. We often look for heroes and villains, for clear-cut moral tales, but history is rarely so simple. Mahan was a man who tried to do the right thing, and he was killed. For it, he was a symbol of hope to some, and a symbol of betrayal to others. His death reminds us that even in the bleakest of times, the motives of individuals are complex, and the consequences of their actions are often unpredictable. Ultimately, the forgotten story of the Potato King is a powerful lesson for us today. It shows us that a single act of kindness cannot undo a lifetime of injustice. It teaches us that true change requires not just individual effort, but a fundamental restructuring of the systems that create and perpetuate suffering. The legacy of Colonel Dennis Mahan is not just a tale of a good man who met a bad end. It is a profound and somber meditation on the role of justice, the nature of charity, and the long, difficult road to societal change. Imagine, if you will, the world as it was before the flick of a switch. A world plunged into a profound and absolute darkness once the sun set. For most of human history, night was a time of vulnerability, a vast and silent void. It was an era when the fear of the unknown was a palpable presence, and the simple act of walking down a street after dusk was a perilous undertaking. Then came gaslight, a revolution that promised to push back the boundaries of night and create a new kind of urban life. But gaslight, like any great innovation, did not simply appear out of thin air. It required an army of unseen workers, a silent legion who walked the city's streets at dusk and dawn, bringing light and safety to the urban sprawl. These were the lamplighters, the unsung heroes of the industrial age. The concept of gaslight itself was a remarkable one, a marvel of 19th century engineering. It was first developed commercially by William Murdoch in the 1790s, but it was not until the early 1800s that it began to be widely adopted. The process involved heating coal in a sealed chamber, a process known as pyrolysis. The gas that was released was then piped through a network of iron pipes, much like modern-day natural gas. At the end of these pipes, street lamps were installed, each with a small burner. When the gas was ignited, it produced a steady, bright flame. This was a monumental leap forward from the dim, flickering light of oil lamps. It was a light so brilliant that it was said to rival the moon itself. But gaslight was not a simple luxury. It was a necessity for the rapidly expanding century. London, Paris, and New York were no longer just collections of villages. They were complex, bustling metropolises. The sheer volume of people, the late-night commerce, and the need for a sense of public order demanded a new kind of illumination. The gas lamps transformed the urban landscape. They extended the working day, making it possible for shops and factories to operate for longer hours. They provided a new sense of security, discouraging crime and making it safe for people to venture out after dark. They created the vibrant, bustling nightlife that we associate with the Victorian era. And yet, this revolution was dependent on the most mundane and repetitive of tasks. The gas lamps did not turn on by themselves. They required a human touch, a steady hand, and a methodical mind. This callous indifference from the British government left the Irish people with no one to turn to. As the famine worsened, the people's quiet desperation turned into a simmering rage. The landlords, who continued to collect rents even as their tenants starved, became the face of this oppression. While many landlords, like Mahone, were struggling themselves and were unable to provide much in the way of relief, A significant number of them were using the famine as an opportunity. They were evicting tenants who couldn't pay their rents, often razing their homes to prevent them from returning. This process, known as clearances, was a brutal and inhumane way to consolidate land and make way for more profitable livestock farming. Mahone's compassionate approach stood in stark contrast to these brutal tactics. His generosity was interpreted by some of his more radical tenants as a sign of weakness. A secret society known as the Ribbonmen, a militant organization dedicated to protecting tenant farmers and retaliating against landlords and their agents, saw Mahon as a potential ally, a man who could be swayed to their cause. They began to exert pressure on him, demanding he do more, even as he was running out of resources. Their demands escalated to threats, and Mahon, who was a man of principle but also a realist, began to fear for his life. The situation came to a head in the summer of 1847. The second and third years of the famine had been particularly brutal, with mass starvation, disease, and emigration. The relief efforts, both public and private, were a disorganized mess. Mahon, in a final attempt to help his tenants, organized a massive emigration scheme. He paid for the passage of hundreds of his tenants to Canada, a seemingly humanitarian act. But these coffin ships, as they came to be known, were often little more than floating death traps. Packed with sick and starving passengers, they were breeding grounds for diseases like typhus. Many of the emigrants died on the journey, and the ones who survived were often in a state of advanced illness. The news of these deaths, as it trickled back to Ireland, was twisted and distorted. The emigration scheme, which Mahon had organized with the best of intentions, was seen by some as a ruthless act of ethnic cleansing, a way for him to rid himself of his starving tenants. The Ribbonmen and other radical groups seized upon this narrative. They branded Mahon as a murderer, a man who had feigned compassion only to betray his own people. The fact that he was one of the few landlords who had actually tried to help was lost in the furious rhetoric. The stage was set for a tragedy. On a cold November evening in 1847, as Mahon was riding in his carriage near his estate, a group of armed men ambushed him. They shot him dead on the side of a lonely road. His assassination sent shockwaves through the country. It was the first high-profile murder of a landlord during the famine, and it marked a turning point. It was a clear signal that the time for passive resistance was over, and that the anger of the starving populace had reached a violent crescendo. Mahon's murder was a stark and brutal illustration of the impossible position he was in. He was a man caught between two worlds, unable to fully align with either. He was a landlord, but his actions were seen as a betrayal of his class. He was a benefactor to his tenants, but his relief efforts were seen as a failure, a final act of cruelty. His story is a poignant one, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned acts can have unintended and tragic consequences in a time of widespread despair and political dysfunction. The death of the Potato King, as some had mockingly called him, was a dark stain on an already bleak chapter of history. It was a final, devastating act in a period defined by suffering. But what was the long-term impact of his death? Did it lead to more violence, or did it serve as a wake-up call? And what does his tragic tale tell us about the nature of charity and the limits of individual action in the face of systemic failure? The assassination of Colonel Dennis Mahon sent a powerful and terrifying message across Ireland. It was not a message of hope, but of a new and brutal reality. His murder, rather than inspiring more acts of charity, instilled fear in the hearts of other landlords. Many of them, already struggling with their own finances, saw Mahone's fate as a clear warning. Charity, in the eyes of the most radicalized tenant groups, was not enough. It was an end to the era of tentative and often insufficient humanitarianism and the beginning of a period of heightened violence. The Land War, a period of agrarian conflict that would last for decades, had found one of its first martyrs. Mahone's death also had a significant political impact. It gave the British government an excuse to take a harder line on Ireland, rather than viewing the assassination as a symptom of a much larger problem. They saw it as a criminal act of terrorism that needed to be put down with force. This hardening of attitudes further entrenched the divide between the Irish people and their British rulers, leading to a cycle of violence and repression. The hopes of a peaceful, cooperative solution to the famine were dashed, replaced by a bitter, long-lasting conflict. The story of Colonel Dennis Mahon, the Potato King who tried to save his people, serves as a poignant and often overlooked cautionary tale. It shows us the limits of individual action in the face of systemic failure. Mahon was a man of good intentions, operating within a broken system. He was a kind landlord in a world of cruel ones, a man of charity in a time of radicalized desperation. His efforts, while extraordinary for their time, were simply not enough to counteract centuries of oppression, economic inequality, and political apathy. In this way, Mahone's story is a microcosm of the entire famine. The Great Famine was not a natural disaster in the traditional sense. It was a societal failure, a human-made tragedy in which the blight was merely the catalyst. The blight may have been what caused the potatoes to rot, but it was the prevailing political and economic systems that allowed millions to starve. The British government's reliance on laissez-faire economics, the power of absentee landlords, and a deep-seated anti-Irish bias all conspired to create a situation where a simple crop failure could lead to 1 million deaths and 1 million more. Emigration's Mahone's tragic end is a somber reflection on the nature of history. We often look for heroes and villains, for clear-cut moral tales, but history is rarely so simple. Mahon was a man who tried to do the right thing, and he was killed. For it, he was a symbol of hope to some and a symbol of betrayal to others. His death reminds us that even in the bleakest of times, the motives of individuals are complex, and the consequences of their actions are often unpredictable. Ultimately, the forgotten story of the Potato King is a powerful lesson for us today. It shows us that a single act of kindness cannot undo a lifetime of injustice. It teaches us that true change requires not just individual effort, but a fundamental restructuring of the systems that create and perpetuate suffering. The legacy of Colonel Dennis Mahon is not just a tale of a good man who met a bad end. It is a profound and somber meditation on the role of justice, the nature of charity, and the long, difficult road to societal change. Imagine, if you will, the world as it was before the flick of a switch. A world plunged into a profound and absolute darkness once the sun set. For most of human history, night was a time of vulnerability, a vast and silent void. It was an era when the fear of the unknown was a palpable presence, and the simple act of walking down a street after dusk was a perilous undertaking. Then came gaslight, a revolution that promised to push back the boundaries of night and create a new kind of urban life. But gaslight, like any great innovation, did not simply appear out of thin air. It required an army of unseen workers, a silent legion who walked the city's streets at dusk and dawn, bringing light and safety to the urban sprawl. These were the lamplighters, the unsung heroes of the industrial age. The concept of gaslight itself was a remarkable one, a marvel of 19th century engineering. It was first developed commercially by William Murdoch in the 1790s, but it was not until the early 1800s that it began to be widely adopted. The process involved heating coal in a sealed chamber, a process known as pyrolysis. The gas that was released was then piped through a network of iron pipes, much like modern-day natural gas. At the end of these pipes, street lamps were installed, each with a small burner. When the gas was ignited, it produced a steady, bright flame. This was a monumental leap forward from the dim, flickering light of oil lamps. It was a light so brilliant that it was said to rival the moon itself. But gaslight was not a simple luxury. It was a necessity for the rapidly expanding century. London, Paris, and New York were no longer just collections of villages. They were complex, bustling metropolises. The sheer volume of people, the late-night commerce, and the need for a sense of public order demanded a new kind of illumination. The gas lamps transformed the urban landscape. They extended the working day, making it possible for shops and factories to operate for longer hours. They provided a new sense of security, discouraging crime and making it safe for people to venture out after dark. They created the vibrant, bustling nightlife that we associate with the Victorian era. And yet, this revolution was dependent on the most mundane and repetitive of tasks. The gas lamps did not turn on by themselves. They required a human touch, a steady hand, and a methodical mind. The lamplighter's job was a daily ritual, a procession that would take place twice a day, every day, rain or shine. At dusk, they would begin their rounds, carrying a long pole with a small hook and a flame at the end. They would walk from lamp to lamp post, hooking the pole onto a small ring at the base of the lamp, turning a valve to release the gas, and then using the flame to ignite it. The work was precise and demanding, requiring a deep familiarity with the streets and a methodical pace. The life of a lamplighter was one of solitude and routine. They were not seen as heroes, but as a silent, almost invisible part of the urban fabric. They were often men of advancing age, or those who were not physically fit for more strenuous labor. Their wages were modest, but the job offered a degree of stability and a sense of purpose. They were the sentinels of the night, the guardians of the gaslight. But their work was not without its challenges. The long, repetitive walks could be monotonous, and they were at the mercy of the elements. In the winter, the bitter cold could make their work a physical ordeal, and in the summer, the relentless heat could be draining. Their existence was one of quiet, unassuming dignity, but as with any job, there were small intricacies, hidden rituals, and unspoken rules. They were the ones who knew the city's streets better than anyone, the ones who saw its secrets unfold in the deepening twilight. They were the ones who saw the city not as a series of grand avenues, but as a labyrinth of 1,000 flickering lights. What was it like to live a life governed by the cycle of light and dark? What were the dangers and rewards of a job that was so essential, yet so invisible? And how did this silent profession, this meticulous ritual, shape the very character of the modern city? The world of the lamplighter was far more complex than a simple walk and light. It was a world of precision, of subtle dangers, and of an intimate knowledge of the city's hidden pulse. The lamplighter's pole was not just a tool, it was an extension of his arm, a finely crafted instrument that required a delicate touch. Each street lamp had its own quirk. Some were harder to light than others. Some had finicky valves, and some were placed in precarious locations. A good lamplighter knew his route by heart, a mental map of his territory, a rhythm that was as ingrained in him as the ebb and flow of the tides. The pace was critical. If he was too fast, he might miss a lamp, leaving a dark patch on his route. And if he was too slow, dusk would overtake him, and the city would be left in darkness. Beyond the simple act of lighting the lamps, the lamplighter was also the first line of defense for the gaslight system. He was responsible for minor repairs, for ensuring that the mantles, the small mesh bags that glowed brightly when heated by the gas flame, were intact and functioning. A broken mantle meant a weak, flickering light, a sign of a job poorly done. He was also a kind of unofficial urban watchman. On his rounds, he would be a silent observer of the city's nocturnal life. He would see late-night revelers, early morning workers, and the occasional criminal. He was an unseen sentinel, a fixture of the streets who saw everything but was rarely noticed. The job was not without its dangers. The gas itself, while a marvel of technology, was also a source of constant risk. Leaks in the pipes were common, and the buildup of gas in the underground system could lead to small explosions, a constant threat to the maintenance crews. The lamplighters themselves had to be careful to properly vent the gas before lighting it, lest a small burst of flame singe their eyebrows. Furthermore, the streets themselves were dangerous places after dark. While the gaslight was a deterrent to some criminals, it also served as a convenient form of illumination for others. A lamplighter, often alone and carrying some small change, was a potential target for petty thieves. He had to be a man of quiet courage, alert to the sounds and movements of the streets, all while maintaining his methodical pace. The social fabric of the lamplighters was a tight one. They were a brotherhood of sorts, a guild of men who understood the particular rhythms of their work. They had their own pubs, their own unspoken code of conduct. They would gather at the end of their shifts, their faces streaked with soot and their hands calloused, to share stories of the night's work. They were men who were deeply connected to the city in a way that most people could not understand. They were not tourists or residents. They were part of the city's very nervous system. They knew its shadows, its secrets, and its quiet moments of beauty. And yet, this profession, so essential to the life of the city, was a paradox of permanence and transience. The lamplighter's job was to bring light to the night, but he was also a living symbol of a technology that was, even in its heyday, being slowly replaced. The first seeds of electric light were already being sown. Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan were already experimenting with incandescent bulbs, a technology that would one day render the lamplighter obsolete. The electric light, a constant, unchanging glow, would not require a human touch to be switched on. It would not need a daily ritual. It would, in its own way, be a kind of automation that would spell the end of a long and storied profession. The lamplighters, in their quiet way, were the last vestiges of a human-powered world. They were the link between the old ways and the new, a final echo of a time when every light, every sound, and every movement in the city was touched by a human hand. Their story, in this sense, is not just a story about a job, but a story about the inexorable march of progress, the silent, relentless way in which technology changes the world, leaving behind the small, human rituals that once defined it. So, as we look back on the lamplighters, we are left with a question. What did the world lose when the electric light came to power? Was it simply a matter of efficiency, or was something more profound lost in the transition from a human-lit world to an automated one? The slow, methodical process of replacing gaslight with electric light was not a single, abrupt event, but a gradual transition that spanned decades. The first public electric street lamps, known as arc lamps, appeared in Paris in the 1870s. But they were harsh, bright, and expensive. It was the invention of the more practical, incandescent light bulb by Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan that truly began to sound the death knell for the lamplighter's profession. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities across the world began to wire their streets for electricity. The lamplighters, a familiar sight for so long, began to disappear. The final, poignant act was often the removal of the old gas lamps, themselves a quiet end to a long-running, if unsung, era. The displacement of the lamplighter was more than just a change in technology. It was a fundamental shift in the relationship between a city and its citizens. Gaslight was a warm, flickering, and deeply human form of illumination. It was a light that had a rhythm, a daily ritual. It was a light that was a direct result of human effort. The electric light, by contrast, was an impersonal, constant, and automated glow. It was a light that was simply on, a result of a massive, unseen electrical grid. This shift from a manual to an automated system changed the very character of the urban night. The streets were no longer lit by a man with a pole, but by a powerful, detached force. The disappearance of the lamplighter represents a loss of what we might call human-scale technology. The job was a direct, tangible link between the city's need for light and the labor of an individual. There was a clear, visible cause and effect. With electric light, that link was severed. The light simply appeared, a magical and almost effortless phenomenon. This detachment from the source of our daily conveniences is a key feature of modern life. We no longer see the hand that lights our streets, or the hand that delivers our mail, or the hand that grows our food. We simply consume the result. The lamplighter's story is a reminder of the thousands of professions that have been quietly rendered obsolete by technological progress. From the ice cutter to the telephone switchboard operator, these jobs were not just tasks. They were a way of life, a part of the cultural fabric. The lamplighter, with his pole and his methodical walk, was a living piece of his city's history. He was a symbol of a time when the urban environment was still, in many ways, a series of interconnected villages, each with its own specific rhythms and rituals. Today, the gas lamp has become a symbol of nostalgia, a quaint and romantic relic of a bygone era. They are often seen in historical districts or in movies set in the 19th century. But their presence is a reminder of a much deeper truth, that progress while often a force for good, always comes with a cost. The loss of the lamplighter was not a tragedy on a grand scale, but it was a small and poignant one. It was the loss of a silent, dignified profession, a loss of a human presence on the streets at a time when they were at their most vulnerable. The lamplighter's legacy is not in the grand pronouncements of history, but in the quiet, human-centered moments that are so often forgotten. And so, as you walk down a city street at night, and the electric lights hum with their constant, unwavering glow, take a moment to remember the man who once walked the same path, bringing light to a darkened world, one flickering flame at a time. The year is 1650. The place is London, a city bustling with the raw energy of a burgeoning global power. In the crowded markets and opulent drawing rooms of the English elite, a new kind of fabric is making its appearance. It is not the heavy wools of the English countryside, nor the fine silks of China. It is a light, colorful, and inexpensive cotton fabric from India, known as calico. At first, it arrives in small, precious quantities, brought back by the intrepid sailors and merchants of the British East India Company. The fabric is a revelation. It is bright, with intricate patterns of flowers and animals, unlike anything Europe has ever seen. It is also surprisingly cheap, and it is easy to wash, a significant advantage in an era when most fabrics were difficult to clean. The fabric's name, calico, is derived from its city of origin, Calicut, a major port on India's Malabar coast. But the fabric itself was produced across the subcontinent, from the skilled weavers of Bengal to the intricate dyers of Gujarat. Indian textile production was, at this point in history, the most advanced in the world. Their techniques for spinning, weaving, and, most importantly, dyeing cotton were unparalleled. They could produce vibrant colors that would not fade with washing, a feat that European manufacturers struggled to replicate. The result was a textile that was not just beautiful, but also incredibly practical. It was a perfect storm of quality, color, and affordability. The demand for calico grew with an almost unprecedented speed. It was not just a luxury item for the wealthy. It was a fabric that could be used by everyone. It was used for clothing, for household furnishings, and even as a symbol of status. The craze for calico swept across Europe, from the drawing rooms of London to the streets of Paris. The East India Company, which had originally been focused on the spice trade, quickly realized that the real profit was in this new, colorful fabric. They began to import it in massive quantities, and the trade routes of the world began to hum with the exchange of goods and money. But this new craze was not without its detractors. The traditional textile industries of Europe, particularly the wool and silk manufacturers of England and France, watched with growing alarm as their markets were flooded with the cheap and popular Indian cottons. These were not just small, localized industries. The wool industry, in particular, was the backbone of the English economy, a source of national pride and immense wealth. The weavers, spinners, and dyers of England saw their livelihoods threatened. They began to organize, to protest, and to demand that their governments take action. They argued that the calico craze was not just an economic threat, but a moral and a social one. They believed that it was a foreign import that was undermining the very fabric of their society. The debate over calico became a national obsession, a struggle that pitted consumer desire against national industry. It was a conflict that highlighted the tension between free trade and protectionism, a battle that continues to this day. The protesters argued that the government had a duty to protect its own people, its own jobs, and its own industries. The merchants, on the other hand, argued that the consumer should have the right to buy the best product at the best price, regardless of where it came from. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a quiet war fought not with muskets, but with legislation and economic policy. But what would be the outcome of this struggle? Would the traditional industries of Europe be able to push back against the tide of globalization? And what would happen to the Indian weavers and dyers, the very people who had created the fabric that was now at the center of a global conflict? The protests against calico imports in England and France grew more organized and vehement. The wool and silk industries, which employed hundreds of thousands of people, were a powerful political force. They argued that the Indian cottons were not just a commercial threat, but a direct assault on the economic security of their nations. This was not merely an economic debate, it was a matter of national identity. The English, in particular, saw their wool trade as a defining feature of their global dominance. The sheep was a symbol of England, and the wool it produced was the source of its wealth and its power. To allow a foreign fabric to supplant it was, in their eyes, an act of national betrayal. The lobbying efforts of the British textile manufacturers led to a series of legislative acts designed to protect their industries. In 1701, Parliament passed the first Calico Act, which prohibited the import of printed and dyed calicos for domestic use. This was a significant, but ultimately insufficient, step. The East India Company simply found a loophole. They began to import plain, undyed calico and had it printed and dyed in England. This created a new, albeit smaller, industry in Britain, but it did little to quell the outrage of the wool manufacturers. The demand for the light, colorful cottons was simply too high. The conflict reached a fever pitch, and in 1721, Parliament passed a more stringent law, the Calico Act of 1721. This act was a sweeping piece of protectionist legislation. It made it illegal to wear, import, or sell any printed or dyed calico fabric, with a few exceptions. The law was enforced with a strictness that seems almost absurd today. People were fined for wearing calico dresses, and merchants were arrested for selling the fabric. The act was a clear and unambiguous attempt to protect the domestic wool and silk industries from foreign competition. It was a victory for the traditional industries, but it was a Pyrrhic one. The Calico Acts had an unintended and transformative consequence. By making it illegal to import and sell the finished product, the British government had inadvertently created a massive incentive for their own manufacturers to figure out how to produce cotton textiles themselves. The demand for the fabric was still immense, and if it could not be met by imports, it would have to be met by domestic production. This legislative act, designed to stifle innovation, instead became the single most important catalyst for the British Industrial Revolution. The British, now forced to compete with the superior Indian textiles, began to pour money and intellect into developing new technologies. They needed to find a way to spin cotton more efficiently, to weave it faster, and to dye it with the vibrant colors that made the Indian fabrics so popular. The race was on. James Hargreaves's spinning jenny, Richard Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's mule V's were not just random inventions. They were direct responses to the challenge posed by Indian calico. These innovations, in turn, led to the development of factories, to the use of steam power, and to the rise of a new kind of manufacturing economy. The Calico Acts, meant to preserve the old order, had instead accelerated the creation of a new one. Meanwhile, in India, the consequences of the Calico Acts were devastating. The once thriving textile industry, a source of immense wealth and artistry, began a long and painful decline. The British East India Company, which had previously been a buyer of Indian textiles, now began to actively suppress them. They imposed heavy tariffs on Indian imports and, later, began to flood the Indian market with cheap, machine-made British textiles. The skilled weavers and dyers of India, whose families had been practicing their craft for generations, were put out of business. The once bustling textile centers of India became ghost towns, their ancient knowledge and artistry lost to the relentless march of industrial progress. The Calico Acts, therefore, were more than just a piece of legislation. They were a pivotal moment in global history. They were the spark that ignited the Industrial Revolution in Britain and at the same time began the long process of deindustrialization in India. They were a perfect storm of economic policy, technological innovation, and political power. But what would be the final outcome of this long and complicated story? And what does this quiet, almost forgotten, Calico War tell us about the nature of international trade and the hidden costs of progress? The long-term consequences of the Calico Acts were nothing short of a global realignment. The legislative protection given to the British textile industry, born out of a desire to preserve the old economic order, instead became the engine of a new one. The technological innovations, spurred by the need to compete with Indian textiles, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the power loom gave Britain an unassailable advantage. The Industrial Revolution, with its factories, steam engines, and mass production, was now in full swing. By the early 19th century, Britain had not only matched India's textile production, but had far surpassed it in terms of scale and speed. The flow of trade was now completely reversed. Instead of importing finished calicos from India, Britain began to export its own cheap, machine-made textiles to the world, including to India itself. The Indian market, once the producer of the finest cottons, was now flooded with British goods. The local Indian weavers, who could not compete with the speed and volume of the British machines, were forced out of business. This process of deindustrialization was a core component of British colonial rule in India. The colony was no longer seen as a source of finished goods, but as a supplier of raw materials, cotton, and a captive market for British manufactured goods. The calico craze, therefore, tells a story far beyond a simple fashion trend. It is a story of global economics, protectionism, and the unintended consequences of policy. The Calico Acts, meant to save a traditional industry, instead destroyed it in a different part of the world and gave birth to the industrial age in Britain. It is a classic example of how a seemingly minor event or policy can have massive, unforeseen ripple effects across the globe. It demonstrates the powerful and often brutal nature of economic competition and the way in which technological innovation can completely upend traditional ways of life. Today, the story of calico is a quiet but potent lesson on globalization and its complexities. It shows us that free trade is rarely a natural state of affairs, and that national governments often intervene to protect their own interests. It also reminds us that the success of one nation's industry can come at the direct cost of another's. The legacy of the calico craze is still with us. The economic disparity between the West and parts of the developing world can, in part, be traced back to these historical moments when a country's industries were either nurtured or dismantled by the forces of global trade and colonial power. So, the next time you put on a cotton shirt or simply look at a patterned fabric, consider its long and complicated journey. It is not just a piece of cloth. It is a historical artifact, a silent witness to a time when a simple fabric from India changed the course of world history, ignited a revolution, and played a role in the rise and fall of empires. The year is 1889. The world, connected by the new arteries of steamships and railways, is a globalized network unlike any before. Information travels at an unprecedented speed via the telegraph, and people move faster and in greater numbers than ever before. But this newfound interconnectedness, a source of great economic and social progress, also has a dark side. It provides a perfect superhighway for something far more sinister. A global pandemic. In late 1889, in the sprawling cities of the Russian Empire, a new disease begins to appear. It is a respiratory illness, much like a severe cold or a mild flu, with symptoms that include fever, body aches, and a debilitating cough. It spreads with a terrifying speed, leaping from person to person, from city to city, and from continent to continent. This was the Russian flu, also known as the Asiatic flu, a name that reflects its perceived origin. It was the first true global pandemic of the modern era, a dress rehearsal for the deadlier pandemics that would follow in the 20th and 21st centuries. The speed of its transmission was a direct result of the new technologies of the Industrial Revolution. A person could now travel from St. Petersburg to Paris in a matter of days, and from London to New York in a couple of weeks. A person carrying the virus could and did act as a vector, bringing the disease to every corner of the globe. The symptoms of the Russian flu were often mild, but its sheer contagiousness and its ability to spread to every demographic were a source of great alarm. In the early stages, it was often dismissed as just a bad cold. But as it spread, it began to have a significant impact on daily life. Businesses were forced to close as workers fell ill en masse. Public transportation ground to a halt as conductors and drivers were too sick to work. The sheer number of people who were sick at the same time created a kind of societal paralysis. In cities like London, the impact was profound. The city, with its dense population and its reliance on public transportation, was a perfect breeding ground for the virus. Hospitals were overwhelmed, not by a high death toll, but by the sheer volume of patients. Doctors and nurses, many of whom were also falling ill, were stretched to their limits. The response from the medical community was a mix of confusion and fear. This was an era before virology, before the understanding of germs and viruses. The prevailing theory was still often the miasma theory, the belief that disease was spread by bad air. The idea that a microscopic organism could be carried by a healthy person and then spread to others was still a revolutionary concept. The Russian flu, unlike the later and far more deadly Spanish flu of 1918, was not primarily a killer of the young and healthy. Its mortality rate was relatively low, estimated to be around 0.1%. But it was its universal reach that made it so significant. It affected the rich and the poor, the young and the old. It was a great social leveler, a silent and indiscriminate force that brought the gears of modern society to a temporary, grinding halt. The disease was often known by different names in different places: the Great Sneezing in some parts of the world, or La Grippe in France. But regardless of its name, its impact was the same. It was a wake-up call to a world that was becoming more and more interconnected. It was a silent, unseen warning of the dangers that a globalized world would face. But what would be the long-term legacy of this forgotten pandemic? Did it, in its own way, prepare the world for the deadlier challenges to come? And what lessons did it offer? Lessons that the world would tragically fail to fully heed just a few decades later. The Russian flu of 1889 to 1890, while largely forgotten, today was a significant event that provided a stark look at the vulnerabilities of a newly interconnected world. Its rapid spread was due to a series of critical factors: the dense urban populations of the industrial age, the new and fast modes of global transport, and the general lack of public health infrastructure and knowledge about infectious diseases. The public response, in many ways, mirrored how we would react today, albeit with far less scientific understanding. People were told to stay indoors, to avoid public gatherings, and to practice personal hygiene, but the advice was often based on a mix of old beliefs and new, unproven theories. One of the most profound effects of the Russian flu was its impact on the global economy. It caused widespread absenteeism in factories, offices, and shops. The supply chains, which were just beginning to be truly global, were disrupted. Ships sat idle in ports because their crews were sick, and trains were delayed because their engineers were too ill to work. The pandemic showed that a seemingly minor illness could bring the gears of the world to a grinding halt, a lesson that would be painfully relearned over a century later. The economic cost of the pandemic, while difficult to calculate precisely, was immense and served as a wake-up call to the fragility of the new global economy. Medically, the Russian flu also had a significant, albeit quiet, impact. It spurred a new kind of scientific inquiry. While the miasma theory was still prevalent, the sheer speed and breadth of the pandemic forced doctors and scientists to look for new explanations. It was one of the first major epidemics to be studied with the help of the burgeoning field of bacteriology, and while the virus itself was not identified at the time, the search for a new kind of pathogen had begun. The pandemic, in its own way, laid the groundwork for the field of virology, which would be crucial in the decades to come. However, despite its global reach and its significant economic and social impact, the Russian flu was largely forgotten. Its relatively low mortality rate meant that it did not leave the same kind of traumatic, indelible mark on the public consciousness as the Black Death or the Spanish flu. There were no mass burials, no widespread social collapse. It was more of a collective inconvenience, a silent shadow that passed over the world before receding into the history books. This amnesia was a tragic error. The world, in its collective sigh of relief, failed to learn the lessons that the Russian flu was so desperately trying to teach. The Spanish flu of 1918, a much more virulent and deadly virus, would follow just a few decades later. The world, despite the earlier warning, was completely unprepared. The public health response was slow and disorganized, and the governments, distracted by the chaos of the First World War, were not able to mount a unified defense. The 1918 flu would go on to kill tens of millions of people, a tragedy of epic proportions. The lessons of 1889, the importance of coordinated public health responses, the understanding of interconnectedness, and the need for scientific foresight had been completely forgotten. The story of the Russian flu is therefore a story of an unheeded warning. It is a quiet narrative about a moment in history when the world was given a glimpse of its own future, a future where a microscopic entity could bring the largest and most powerful empires to their knees. It was a pandemic that passed over the world like a shadow, a silent precursor to the storms to come. So, as we reflect on this quiet, forgotten piece of history, we are left with a powerful and perhaps chilling thought. What other warnings, what other small but significant events have we failed to notice in our own time? And are we, in our modern, interconnected world, truly prepared for the next one? The Russian flu of 1889 to 1890, for all its quiet terror, was ultimately a pandemic that the world was able to absorb and eventually forget. Its low mortality rate and its passage during a period of relative peace and prosperity meant that it did not leave the same deep scars as other historical plagues. But its legacy, while largely unseen, is a crucial one. It was the first time that humanity truly experienced a global pandemic in a modern, interconnected world. It was a test case, a kind of dry run for the far more deadly events to come. It provided a wealth of data, observations, and lessons that were, tragically, set aside in the rush of the new century. The most significant and overlooked lesson of the Russian flu was the crucial role of speed. The pandemic demonstrated, for the first time on a global scale, just how quickly a pathogen could travel. This was a direct result of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, the steamship, the railway, and the telegraph. The old barriers of time and distance were no longer a defense against the spread of disease. This new reality demanded a new kind of response, one that was coordinated, rapid, and global. But the world of 1889, with its nationalistic governments and its nascent international cooperation, was not yet ready for such a challenge. The amnesia surrounding the Russian flu is a powerful historical example of human nature's tendency to forget inconvenient truths. Because the pandemic did not result in a catastrophic loss of life, it was relegated to a footnote in the history books. There were no great monuments to its victims, no collective national trauma to commemorate. It was a problem that was solved, and once solved, it was forgotten. This historical oversight was a fatal one. The world of 1918, facing a far more virulent strain of influenza, would have benefited immensely from the lessons of a generation earlier. They would have known to act swiftly, to close borders, and to communicate across nations. But they were, in many ways, starting from scratch. Today, the story of the Russian flu is more relevant than ever. In our own highly interconnected world, with jet travel and global supply chains, the lessons of 1889 are not just historical curiosities, they are a vital playbook. We have relearned, in our own time, the importance of coordinated public health responses, the role of data in tracking a pandemic, and the economic and social costs of a global health crisis. The quiet, forgotten story of the Russian flu is a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of grand events, but also a series of subtle, overlooked moments that hold the keys to our future. So, as you go about your day, in a world that is more connected than ever before, remember the silent shadow of the Russian flu. It was a warning whispered to a world that was too busy to listen, a prelude to a storm that was, in its own way, a long time coming. The year is 1850. The place is London, a city that, to an outsider, would appear to be permanently shrouded in a dense, yellowish black cloud. This was not a natural phenomenon, not a simple mist from the River Thames. This was the infamous London fog, a foul, sooty concoction of coal smoke, industrial fumes, and natural mist that would, at times, bring the entire metropolis to a standstill. It was a permanent fixture of London life, a symbol of its industrial might and, at the same time, a sign of its profound environmental decay. The fog, a tangible presence in the city, was a direct result of the millions of coal fires that burned in homes and factories across the city. Each chimney, a small volcano of smoke, contributed to the ever-present pall. The sheer density of the smog was staggering. It would coat everything in a layer of grime, sting the eyes, and make the simple act of breathing a struggle. The London fog, or pea souper, as it was affectionately called, was more than just a nuisance. It was a public health crisis. The soot and sulfur dioxide it contained led to a high incidence of respiratory diseases, from bronchitis to pneumonia. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a silent killer that contributed to the deaths of thousands every year. But the fog also created a need, and with that need, a profession was born. A profession that was, in its own way, as grimy and as tragic as the fog itself: the chimney sweep. The chimney sweep's job was to clean the soot and tar out of the narrow, twisting flues of London's thousands of chimneys. It was a vital job, a necessity for a city that relied on coal for warmth and cooking. A blocked chimney was not just a fire hazard. It was a danger to the entire household, as the buildup of soot could lead to the release of deadly carbon monoxide gas. The chimney sweep was the unsung hero of the home, the man who, in his own sooty way, kept the domestic heart of the city beating. But the reality of a chimney sweep's life was far from romantic. The job was filthy, dangerous, and incredibly hard on the body. It was a profession that, for a long time, was dominated by a particularly tragic group of people, young boys. The flues of the chimneys were often too narrow for an adult to climb. So master sweeps would hire and train young boys, often orphans or children from impoverished families, to do the work. These boys, sometimes as young as 4 years old, would be sent up the dark, sooty tunnels, their bodies contorting to fit into the cramped spaces. The conditions these boys worked in were horrific. They were often sent up the chimneys, naked to prevent their clothes from getting stuck. They were often forced to climb by a master sweep who would light a fire under them to encourage them to move faster. The work was brutal on their small bodies. They suffered from a litany of ailments, from bruised and scraped skin to respiratory illnesses caused by inhaling the soot. They also suffered from a form of cancer known as chimney sweeps cancer, a particularly grim and painful disease caused by the carcinogens in the soot. The life of a climbing boy was a life of quiet suffering and profound hardship. They were a forgotten part of the city, a hidden underclass that was essential to the comfort of the wealthy, but was rarely, if ever, seen. Their existence was a stark and brutal reminder of the human cost of the Industrial Revolution, a silent testament to the fact that progress and cleanliness, for some, came at the expense of others. Who were these children, and what was their daily life like? What were the forces that kept them in this dangerous profession, and what would it take to finally bring an end to this shameful chapter of history? The climbing boys, as they were known, were a fundamental part of the London's chimney sweep trade. The system was based on a master-apprentice relationship, though in reality it was often closer to a form of indentured servitude. The master sweep, a man of some means who owned the tools of the trade and had a client list, would purchase or indenture a boy from an orphanage or a poor family. This contract would bind the boy to the master for a period of years, during which time he was, for all intents and purposes, the master's property. The boys were given a small pittance, if anything, and were often provided with only the bare necessities for survival: a thin blanket, some meager food, and a place to sleep, often in the cellar among the tools of their trade. Their daily life was a grueling routine of physical and mental torment. The boys would wake before dawn, their bodies already stiff and sore from the previous day's work. They would then be sent up the chimneys, often with a scraper and a brush. The work was not just physically demanding, it was also psychologically terrifying. The chimneys were dark, claustrophobic, and filled with a thick, suffocating cloud of soot. It was not uncommon for boys to get stuck, and the master sweep, desperate to finish the job and move on to the next one, would often resort to cruel methods to get them out, including lighting a fire below them or prodding them with a stick. The dangers were manifold. Beyond the constant risk of getting stuck or burned, the boys faced a lifetime of health problems. The inhalation of soot, a fine powder filled with carcinogens, led to chronic respiratory illnesses, including a particularly gruesome disease known as chimney sweeps cancer. It was a cancer of the scrotum, a painful and disfiguring disease that was almost always fatal. The boys also suffered from a range of other physical ailments, from stunted growth to deformities caused by contorting their bodies into unnatural positions. Many died young, their lungs and bodies simply giving out under the strain. Despite the obvious cruelty of the practice, it was, for a long time, legally sanctioned and widely accepted. The public, who relied on the boys to keep their homes warm and safe, simply turned a blind eye to the reality of their lives. It was a classic example of moral blindness, where a society willingly ignores a terrible injustice because it benefits from it, but a few brave souls refused to be silent. The most prominent of these was the social reformer and philanthropist, Lord Shaftesbury. Lord Shaftesbury, a tireless advocate for the rights of children, made the abolition of climbing boys his life's work. He used his position in Parliament to bring the issue to the forefront of public consciousness. His efforts, however, were met with fierce resistance. The master sweeps, a powerful and organized lobby, argued that the climbing boys were essential to the trade. They claimed that no mechanical brush could possibly clean a chimney as well as a small, nimble boy. They also argued with a degree of social Darwinism that was common for the time, that the boys were better off as sweeps than they would have been on the streets, a classic justification for exploitation. The public, too, was slow to accept a change that might make their lives less convenient. The fight to save the climbing boys would be a long, difficult, and frustrating one. The story of the chimney sweeps is not just a tale of child labor. It is a story about the slow, grinding process of social reform. It shows us that even in a society that is rapidly modernizing and becoming more humane, the deep-seated prejudices and economic interests of the powerful can be a formidable obstacle to progress. The fight to end the use of climbing boys was a test of Britain's conscience, a question of whether a nation that was at the height of its power could look at its own injustices and find the moral will to correct them. What would be the final outcome of this long and difficult struggle? How did this quiet movement, this small act of rebellion against the status quo, finally succeed? And what does it say about the nature of social change itself? The fight to end the use of climbing boys was a long, arduous process, marked by repeated legislative attempts and fierce opposition. Lord Shaftesbury, undeterred by initial failures, led a relentless campaign, bringing the plight of the children to the public's attention through vivid accounts and parliamentary debates. The first Chimney Sweepers Act of 1840 was a step in the right direction, prohibiting the use of boys under 10, but it was largely unenforceable. The master sweeps simply ignored the law, and the public, accustomed to the convenience of the climbing boys, did not report them. It would take decades of continued pressure and the tireless work of reformers to finally succeed. A key turning point came with the Children's Employment Commission of 1842, which documented in horrifying detail the abuse and suffering of the climbing boys. The report, widely circulated and read, shocked the Victorian public and began to turn the tide of public opinion. The image of the sooty-faced boy, once a symbol of a quaint trade, was now seen as a national shame. The tragic deaths of several climbing boys who suffocated in chimneys also served as a powerful and grim reminder of the cruelty of the practice. But it was not until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, a full 35 years after the first attempt, that the use of climbing boys was finally and effectively outlawed. This act gave the police the power to prosecute master sweeps and required all sweeps to be licensed, making it easier to monitor and enforce the law. The abolition of the climbing boys was a victory not just for the children, but for the entire concept of social justice. It demonstrated that a persistent and focused reform movement could, over time, overcome powerful economic interests and ingrained social attitudes. It was a testament to the power of a few dedicated individuals to change the course of a nation's history. The London fog, the very thing that made the chimney sweeps so essential, would also be a catalyst for change. The Great Smog of 1952, a 4-day weather inversion that trapped a lethal layer of fog and smoke over London and killed over 12,000 people, was the final and most devastating act in this sooty drama. It led to the Clean Air Act of 1956, which finally addressed the root cause of the fog and made the city's air breathable once more. The story of the chimney sweeps is a powerful reminder that some of the most significant changes in history are not born of a single grand event, but of a long, quiet, and often brutal struggle against apathy and injustice. It shows us that progress is not an inevitability, but a result of human resilience and moral conviction. The resilience of the climbing boys, in the face of unimaginable hardship, is a silent and enduring testament to the human spirit. Their story, once a shameful secret, is now a powerful lesson on the moral obligations of a society to its most vulnerable members. So, as you look at a modern city with its clean air and its unseen systems, remember the ghost of the climbing boy. He is a part of the city's past, a silent reminder of the price of progress and the long, slow, and ultimately victorious fight for human dignity. The year is 1870. The place is a small, quiet street in London. The rhythmic and familiar sound of a brass knocker echoes down the lane. This is the sound of the postman, a figure so ingrained in the fabric of Victorian life that he was almost invisible. He was a silent, daily presence, a walking repository of the city's stories, its joys, and its sorrows. In an era before telephones and instant communication, the postal system was the lifeblood of a nation. It was the only way for a family in London to hear from a son in India, for a businessman to close a deal with a partner in Liverpool, or for a young man to declare his love to a girl across town. The postman was the human link in this vast, intricate network, a man whose daily routine was a vital and ponderous burden. The postal system itself was a marvel of Victorian efficiency. The uniform penny post, introduced in 1840 by Sir Rowland Hill, was a revolutionary concept. It standardized the cost of sending a letter, making it affordable for everyone, not just the wealthy. This simple change had a profound and immediate impact. The volume of mail exploded, and the postal service, once a small, inefficient government body, became a massive, complex machine. It was a machine that required an army of people to run it, from the sorters in the vast sorting rooms to the men who delivered the mail to every corner of the British Empire. The postman's day began before dawn. He would arrive at the sorting office, a cavernous, bustling building filled with the sound of shuffling paper and low conversation. Here he would be given his walk, a large sack filled with letters, parcels, and postcards. The weight of this sack was often staggering, a physical manifestation of the sheer volume of human communication. The postman's walk was a long and arduous one, often covering miles of city streets in all weather conditions. He was a man of the streets, a quiet, uncomplaining figure who was as much a part of the urban landscape as the gas lamps and the chimney pots. The job was not just about physical endurance. It required a deep and intimate knowledge of the city's streets, its addresses, and its people. A good postman knew his route like the back of his hand. He knew which houses had a letterbox and which required him to knock. He knew which families were expecting good news and which were in a state of mourning. He was, in a quiet and unofficial way, a part of the community, a trusted figure who carried not just mail, but a part of a person's life. But the postman's life was also one of profound solitude. He spent his days walking, often in silence, with only his thoughts and the city for company. He was a witness to the daily dramas of a great city, but he was not a participant. He was a ghost, a transient figure who came and went, leaving a small piece of paper that could change a person's life forever. His was a job that was both essential and overlooked, a quiet act of service that was the foundation of a new kind of interconnected world. What was it like to carry the weight of an entire community on your back, both literally and figuratively? What were the challenges and the quiet rewards of a job that was so vital, yet so anonymous? And what does the life of a Victorian postman tell us about the nature of communication and the human need for connection? The postman's walk was a daily ritual, a long and demanding journey that often involved multiple deliveries a day. In the early part of the Victorian era, the postal system was still operating on a more traditional model, with 2 or 3 deliveries a day in larger cities. This meant that the postman's day was a relentless cycle of returning to the sorting office, collecting a new batch of mail, and setting out again. The physical toll of this work was immense. A postman could easily walk 10 to 15 miles a day, his back and shoulders straining under the weight of his mailbag. His feet, encased in often ill-fitting boots, would ache with every step. The work was so physically demanding that it was often a job for younger men, as the older men simply couldn't keep up. But beyond the physical burden, the postman also carried a much more subtle, emotional one. He was, in a quiet way, a keeper of secrets and a harbinger of news. He carried letters of love and letters of loss, business deals and family disputes, all bundled together in his sack. He was the first to know of a birth or a death in the family, the first to know of a new job or a failed business venture. And while he was not a part of these stories, he was a witness to them. He would see the look of joy on a person's face when they received a letter from a loved one, and the look of sorrow when they received a letter with a black border, a sign of mourning. This emotional weight, this constant proximity to the dramas of human life, was a quiet but significant part of his job. The postman's role in society was also a source of some status and respect. He was, after all, a representative of the crown. His uniform, a smart blue or red coat with brass buttons, gave him a sense of authority and respectability. He was a trusted figure, a person who could be relied upon to deliver a message with efficiency and discretion. The public, who relied so heavily on his services, often held him in high regard. In some small towns and villages, he was a kind of informal news anchor, a person who could be relied upon to share a bit of gossip or a small piece of information that had been passed along his route. He was a silent but essential part of the social fabric. However, the postman's job was not a simple, uninterrupted walk. It was a journey fraught with small, mundane challenges. The weather, of course, was a constant foe. Rain would turn the streets to mud, and snow could make his route a treacherous undertaking. He also had to contend with the more unpredictable elements of city life, from stray dogs to impatient drivers. But the greatest challenge was often the sheer volume of mail. The uniform penny post had been a massive success, but the postal service struggled to keep up with the demand. The postman, as the man at the end of the line, was often the one who bore the brunt of this inefficiency. He was the man who had to deliver the ever-growing pile of letters, no matter how heavy his bag or how tired his feet. The postman's daily journey was a testament to human resilience and the quiet dignity of labor. It was a job that was both anonymous and vital, a profession that was at once a part of the grand tapestry of a global empire and a simple daily ritual of a quiet man walking his route. His story is a story of how a small, ordinary job can be a crucial part of a much larger and much more significant historical moment. What was the legacy of the Victorian postman, and how did his work help to shape the world we live in today? And what lessons can we draw from his quiet and arduous life? The life of the Victorian postman, a figure so central yet so anonymous, had a profound and lasting impact on the world we live in today. His daily, arduous routine was a crucial part of the engine that powered the Victorian information age. The uniform penny post, a system he helped to implement and sustain, democratized communication. For the first time, people of all social classes could afford to send and receive letters, a simple act that had a revolutionary effect. It enabled families to stay in touch across continents. It fueled the growth of commerce, and it allowed for the rapid spread of ideas, from scientific discoveries to political ideologies. The postman, with his heavy bag and his silent, determined stride, was the human embodiment of this new era of communication. The Victorian postman's legacy is also a testament to the quiet dignity of labor. His job was physically demanding and repetitive, but it was also a source of pride and purpose. He was a trusted member of the community, a person whose presence was a daily, reliable assurance that the world was still connected, that a message could and would be delivered. In a world that was becoming increasingly fast-paced and complex, he was a steady and constant figure, a symbol of a time when the most crucial of services were still performed by a human being. The rise of the telegraph, and later the telephone, would eventually change the postman's role, but it would not make him obsolete. While instant communication took over certain functions, the postal service continued to be the bedrock of commercial and personal correspondence. The postman's job evolved, but his core function, the physical delivery of a tangible message. In our own time, in an era of email and instant messaging, the role of the postal worker is a powerful reminder that there is still value in a physical connection, in the weight of a letter, and in the quiet, human act of delivery. The story of the Victorian postman is a meditation on the unseen infrastructure that holds a society together. It is a story about the thousands of people who perform the mundane but essential tasks that make modern life possible. It is a story about the human need for connection and the quiet resilience of those who, in their own way, have made that connection possible. So, as you go about your day, in a world that is always connected and always on, remember the quiet figure who once walked the streets of London, carrying a ponderous burden of human stories, one letter at a time. The year is 1890. The place is London, a city plagued not just by smog and disease, but by a new and increasingly common urban affliction, insomnia. The rapid pace of industrial life, the constant hum of the city, the stress of a new, competitive economy, all of these factors conspired to rob the Victorian man of his sleep. Doctors and medical professionals were faced with a new kind of patient, one who was not suffering from a physical malady, but from a mental and spiritual one. They were exhausted, anxious, and desperate for a cure. In an era before modern pharmacology, before sleeping pills and tranquilizers, the medical community turned to a variety of strange and, by today's standards, bizarre treatments. One of the most popular and enduring of these was the cold bath cure. The cold bath cure was not a new concept. The use of water for therapeutic purposes, known as hydrotherapy, has a long history, but it was in the Victorian era that it became a medical fad. The logic behind the cold bath was rooted in a mixture of classical ideas about the body and new Victorian beliefs about masculinity and self-control. The Victorians believed that the body was a kind of hydraulic system, and that ailments were often caused by an imbalance of fluids or a kind of nervous overstimulation. Insomnia, in particular, was seen as a product of an overactive mind, a brain that refused to shut down at the end of the day. The cold bath was seen as a way to shock the system, to reset it, and to calm the nervous energy that was preventing sleep. The process was simple, yet profoundly unpleasant. A patient suffering from insomnia would be instructed to take a bath that was not warm or comfortable, but filled with icy cold water. They would be told to immerse themselves in the water for a period of several minutes, sometimes even longer. The shock of the cold water was believed to have a therapeutic effect, to jolt the patient out of their state of nervous agitation and to induce a kind of physical exhaustion that would lead to sleep. The treatment was often accompanied by other strange medical practices, including special diets, exercise regimes, and even the use of strange, unproven tonics. But the cold bath cure was not just a medical treatment. It was also a test of Victorian stoicism and masculinity. The ability to endure the profound discomfort of an icy bath was seen as a sign of inner strength and self-control, qualities that were highly valued in the Victorian era. A man who could conquer his own body and mind, who could endure the cold and come out on the other side, was a man who was worthy of respect. It was a kind of self-inflicted discipline, a way of proving that one was not weak or soft, but a master of one's own destiny. The cold bath cure, in its own peculiar way, was a perfect reflection of the Victorian mindset. It was a blend of medical ignorance, moral rectitude, and a deep-seated belief in the power of discipline and self-denial. But what was the reality of this treatment? Did it actually work? And what does its popularity tell us about the hidden anxieties and fears of an era that we often see as being one of unassailable confidence and progress? The cold bath cure and other forms of hydrotherapy were part of a broader and largely unscientific medical movement of the Victorian era. Doctors, lacking the modern understanding of neurology and psychology, were working with a limited toolbox. They believed that the body was a kind of machine, and that illness was a result of a mechanical failure. Insomnia, a mysterious and debilitating ailment, was seen as a kind of short circuit in the nervous system. The cold bath was a radical, an immediate way to reboot the system, to shock the body into a state of rest. The popularity of the cold bath cure can also be understood in the context of the Victorian social and moral climate. This was an era that valued discipline, self-control, and the triumph of the will over the body's weaknesses. The cold bath was a physical and psychological test, a way for a man to prove his mettle. It was a form of self-purification, a ritual that was meant to cleanse not just the body, but the soul. The Victorians, with their emphasis on cleanliness and purity, saw the bath as a symbolic act of washing away the anxieties and moral failings of the day. But did it actually work? For a few, it might have. The shock of the cold water could, in some cases, induce a state of physical exhaustion that would lead to sleep. The ritual of the bath, the act of preparing for it, and the mental effort of enduring it could also have a kind of placebo effect. It gave the patient a sense of agency, a feeling that they were actively fighting their illness, which in itself could be a source of comfort. But for the vast majority of people, the cold bath was an unpleasant and ultimately ineffective solution. It was a medical fad, a temporary fix that was replaced by other fads as soon as a new theory or a new treatment emerged. The story of the cold bath cure is a quiet but powerful testament to the limitations of medical knowledge in the 19th century. Doctors, faced with a new and complex set of ailments that were a direct result of modern life, were forced to rely on old theories and unproven remedies. They were grappling with a problem that was not just physical, but psychological and sociological. The cold bath was a physical response to a mental problem, a desperate attempt to use the body to fix the mind. The hidden anxieties of the Victorian era are on full display in this story. The Victorian man, despite his public image of stoicism and control, was deeply anxious. The stress of a new, competitive economy, the fear of social failure, and the constant pressure to maintain a respectable facade were all a part of his daily life. Insomnia, in this context, was not just a medical problem. It was a symptom of a deeper societal malaise. The cold bath was a way of dealing with this malaise, a ritual that was meant to reassure a man that he was still in control, even when his mind was betraying him. What was the ultimate fate of this bizarre medical practice? How did the world finally move beyond the cold bath and the other strange remedies of the Victorian era? And what does this forgotten chapter of medical history tell us about our own quest for sleep in a modern, equally anxious world? PEE as a symptom of a deeper psychological or emotional problem. The treatment, therefore, shifted from a physical one to a therapeutic one, a conversation that sought to address the root causes of the patient's anxiety and stress. The story of the cold bath cure, therefore, is a quiet but powerful testament to the evolution of medical thought. It shows us how a society's approach to health and wellness is a reflection of its values and its level of scientific understanding. The Victorian era, with its emphasis on physical discipline and moral rectitude, saw the cold bath as a legitimate and even virtuous form of treatment. A more scientifically and psychologically minded 20th century, with its emphasis on efficiency and convenience, saw it as a bizarre and unnecessary ordeal. The cold bath cure was not a failure of Victorian medicine. It was a symptom of its limitations, a physical remedy for a problem it did not yet have the language to understand. Today, the cold bath cure is a historical curiosity, a strange and almost humorous example of a bygone medical fad. But its legacy, in an ironic twist, is still with us. Modern athletes and wellness enthusiasts have rediscovered the benefits of cold. Immersion therapy, from ice baths to cold showers, not as a cure for insomnia, but as a way to reduce muscle inflammation, improve circulation, and enhance mental fortitude. The ritual has been divorced from its Victorian moralism and embraced for its physiological benefits, a testament to the idea that even the most bizarre historical practices can, in a new context, find a new and useful purpose. So, as you struggle to fall asleep in our own fast-paced, anxious world, consider the Victorian man who, in his own quiet desperation, would plunge himself into a tub of icy water. His story is a powerful and poignant reminder that the search for a good night's sleep is a timeless one. a human struggle that has been fought with strange and wonderful methods for centuries. The year is 1888. The place is the East End of London, a landscape of poverty, squalor, and grimy industrial labor. Here, in the sprawling factories of Bryant and May, a new kind of worker toils in silence. The matchstick girl. The match, a simple and ubiquitous invention, was a revolutionary tool. It was a small, cheap, and convenient way to create fire on demand. It lit the stoves in 1,000 homes, the lamps in 1,000 streets, and the cigars in 1,000 drawing rooms. It was, in its own way, a symbol of progress, a tiny, self-contained burst of civilization. But the process of making these matches, a process that was largely invisible to the public, was a brutal and horrifying one. It was a process that relied on the cheap and exploited labor of women and girls, a hidden part of the urban industrial machine. The matchstick girls, often as young as 10 years old, worked in the factories for long hours, for meager wages. Their job was to dip the wooden sticks into a solution of white phosphorus, a highly toxic and volatile substance. The work was monotonous and physically demanding, but the greatest danger was not the long hours or the low pay. It was the phosphorus itself. White phosphorus, a key ingredient in the production of friction matches, was a poison. Its fumes, when inhaled, would lead to a gruesome and painful disease known as phossy jaw. Phossy jaw was a slow and agonizing illness that would literally rot a person's jawbone. It would begin with a severe toothache, followed by a swelling of the gums and jaw. As the disease progressed, the jawbone would turn a phosphorescent greenish white, a grim and haunting glow that was visible in the dark. The bone would eventually decay and die, leaving the victim with a disfigured face and a lifetime of chronic pain. The only known cure was a brutal surgical procedure to remove the jawbone, a procedure that was often performed without anesthesia and with a low success rate. The matchstick girls, in their innocence, were largely unaware of the dangers of the substance they were working with. The company, Bryant and May, with its powerful political connections and its immense profits, was well aware of the risks, but they chose to do nothing. They provided no safety equipment, no ventilation, and no medical care for the girls. They simply saw them as a disposable part of the production process, a cheap and expendable labor force that was necessary to meet the insatiable demand for matches. The story of the matchstick girls is a quiet and tragic one, a story of an industry that, in its pursuit of profit, was willing to sacrifice the health and well-being of its workers. It is a story of a silent, invisible disease that was a direct result of industrial exploitation. But it is also a story of resilience and rebellion. In their own way, these matchstick girls, with their dirty faces and their tired hands, would become a force for social change. They would, in their own quiet way, change the course of labor history. What would it take for these girls, a forgotten and powerless part of society, to rise up and demand justice? What was the moment that finally brought their plight to the public's attention? And what does their story tell us about the nature of corporate responsibility and the hidden costs of industrial progress? The plight of the matchstick girls was a hidden and almost invisible tragedy, but it would not remain that way forever. The person who would finally bring their suffering to light was a woman named Annie Besant, a prominent social reformer, women's rights activist, and a formidable journalist. Besant was a radical thinker who was already well known for her activism. But her investigation into the conditions at Bryant and May would become her most famous campaign. She was tipped off by a few of the girls who, in their quiet desperation, had managed to convey their story to her. Besant, a fierce and relentless investigator, was horrified by what she found. The long hours, the meager wages, and, most importantly, the horrific effects of the white phosphorus in 1888. Besant published an expose in her newspaper. The link, the article, titled White Slavery in London, was a scathing and unsparing look at the reality of the matchstick girls' lives. She detailed the long hours, the poor pay, and the horrifying effects of phossy jaw. The article was a bombshell. The public, who had been consuming these matches in their millions, were shocked and disgusted by the brutal reality of their production. The article was a direct challenge to Bryant and May, a massive and politically powerful company that had long operated with impunity. The company's reaction was swift and predictable. They denied the accusations, calling Besant a liar and a troublemaker. They tried to coerce their workers into signing a statement that would discredit Besant and her report, but the girls, in a quiet act of immense courage, refused. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They had been exploited for too long, and they saw a chance to finally stand up for themselves. Their refusal to sign was the spark that ignited a new kind of rebellion. On July 2nd, 1888, after a girl was fired for a minor infraction, the Matchstick Girls, in a spontaneous and unprecedented act of solidarity, walked out of the factory. They went on strike. It was not a planned or organized strike, but a desperate, organic uprising. The strike was a direct result of Besant's article and the girls' newfound sense of empowerment. It was a clear and unambiguous message to Bryant and May and to the world: we will not be silent, and we will not be exploited anymore. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 was a watershed moment in the history of British labor. It was one of the first strikes organized by and for unskilled women workers. It was a strike that was not about wages or hours, but about human dignity and the right to work in a safe environment. The public, moved by the girls' plight, rallied to their cause. A strike fund was started, and people from all walks of life contributed. The strike received widespread media coverage, and the public's sympathy was firmly on the side of the girls. The company, faced with a public relations nightmare and the loss of its workforce, was forced to capitulate. The strike was a victory for the Matchstick Girls and for the larger labor movement. It forced Bryant and May to agree to the girls' demands, including the provision of safety equipment, the end of fines, and the establishment of a grievance committee. But the strike was not the end of the story. The white phosphorus itself was still a problem. The long-term battle to ban the substance would be a much more difficult and protracted one. How did the world finally manage to outlaw this dangerous substance? What was the final push that made it happen? And what does the quiet heroism of the Matchstick Girls tell us about the nature of social change? The strike of the Matchstick Girls was a monumental victory, but the core issue, the use of toxic white phosphorus, remained. The strike forced Bryant and May to improve working conditions, but they refused to abandon the profitable and efficient substance. The real fight to outlaw it would be a long global battle, one that required the cooperation of governments and the pressure of a sustained international campaign. The victory of the Matchstick Girls, however, had provided the crucial momentum. It had made the public aware of the invisible dangers of industrial production and had put the spotlight on the need for corporate responsibility. The final push came from a broader international movement. In 1906, the Berne Convention was signed. In Switzerland, an international treaty that sought to ban the use of white phosphorus in the production of matches. The treaty was a direct result of decades of lobbying by public health advocates and labor activists. But even with the treaty in place, many countries, including the United States, were slow to ratify it. It was the invention of a non-alternative, the red phosphorus safety match, that finally made the ban commercially viable. The new matches, which were much safer, had already been invented in Sweden in the 1840s, but they were more expensive to produce, and the patent was held by a Swedish company. It was not until the patents expired and the public outcry reached a fever pitch that the major match companies were finally forced to abandon the use of the cheaper but more dangerous white phosphorus. The story of the Matchstick Girls is a powerful and poignant example of how a small, seemingly insignificant group of people can change the course of history. Their strike was not just about better working conditions. It was about human dignity. It was about the right to work without fear of a slow and agonizing death. Their courage, in the face of immense power and corporate indifference, was a crucial turning point in the history of labor rights. It was a clear signal that the public would no longer tolerate the exploitation of the most vulnerable for the sake of profit. The legacy of the Matchstick Girls is a quiet one, but it is deeply ingrained in the fabric of modern life. Their strike helped to lay the groundwork for a century of labor reform, from child labor laws to workplace safety regulations. It reminds us that every single product we consume, no matter how small or mundane, has a history, a production process, and often a human cost. The simple act of striking a match today is a silent, flickering tribute to the girls who, in their own quiet and courageous way, fought for a safer and more just world. And so, as you go about your day, and perhaps light a candle or a stove with a match, take a moment to remember the unseen labor and the silent suffering that made that simple act of creating fire possible. The year is 1761. The place is the workshop of a man named John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter and clockmaker from Lincolnshire, England. Harrison is an unassuming figure, but in his hands, he holds the key to a problem that has plagued mariners and scientists for centuries: how to accurately determine longitude at sea. The problem of longitude was one of the greatest scientific and practical challenges of the 18th century. Sailors could determine their latitude by looking at the stars, but without a reliable way to know their longitude, their east-west position, they were, in essence, lost at sea. This lack of knowledge led to countless shipwrecks, a loss of untold wealth, and a constant, low-grade fear for all who ventured out of sight of land. The British government, recognizing the immense importance of solving this problem, had offered a staggering prize, the equivalent of millions of dollars today, to anyone who could invent a reliable method for determining longitude at sea. This was the Longitude Act of 1714. The act set in motion a scientific and free technical competition that drew in the greatest minds of the era. The establishment, a group of brilliant astronomers and mathematicians, believed that the solution lay in the stars, in a complex series of celestial observations. They were a powerful and influential group, and they looked down on John Harrison, a simple craftsman with no formal education, with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. But Harrison, in his quiet workshop, was on a different path. He believed that the solution was not in the heavens, but in a machine. He believed that a clock, a machine that could keep perfect time, was the answer. His logic was simple. If a sailor had a clock set to the time of a known location, and he could compare that time to the local time wherever he was, he could calculate his longitude. The problem was that no clock in the world was accurate enough for this purpose. The rolling seas, the changes in temperature and air pressure, and the inherent inaccuracies of mechanical clocks made them useless for long-distance navigation. The clocks of the era were, in short, not up to the task. But John Harrison was a man of an almost fanatical dedication. He spent decades of his life, from the 1730s to the 1760s, building a series of increasingly complex and accurate timekeepers. He worked in relative obscurity, his single-minded obsession a source of ridicule from his neighbors and his scientific rivals. He was a man of quiet genius, a craftsman who had to overcome not just the technical challenges of his work, but the profound skepticism of a world that was convinced the answer lay in the stars, not in a box of brass and springs. The story of John Harrison is a quiet one, a tale of a single man and his lifelong obsession. It is a story of a battle between a brilliant mind and the forces of scientific and social inertia. But what was the final outcome of his struggle? Did he finally succeed in his quest? And what does his quiet, overlooked story tell us about the nature of genius and the power of a single brilliant idea to change the world? John Harrison's quest to solve the longitude problem was a battle not just against the laws of physics, but against the very establishment of his time. The Board of Longitude, the body tasked with judging the contestants, was largely comprised of astronomers and mathematicians. They were intellectually committed to a celestial solution, the lunar distance method, which involved complex calculations of the moon's position relative to the stars. The idea that a mere mechanic could solve the problem with a machine was anathema to them. They viewed Harrison's work with suspicion, seeing him as a stubborn and uneducated upstart. Harrison, undeterred, spent his life building a series of increasingly accurate clocks, which he called sea clocks. His first three clocks, H1, H2, and H3, were masterpieces of craftsmanship, incorporating brilliant innovations such as a bimetallic strip to compensate for temperature changes and caged roller bearings to reduce friction. But they were still too large and cumbersome for practical use on a ship. It was his fourth clock, H4, that would become his masterwork. It was a small, unassuming watch, about the size of a large pocket watch. It was a triumph of miniaturization and precision, a machine that was able to keep time with an accuracy that was previously unimaginable. In 1761, H4 was put to the ultimate test. It was taken on a voyage to Jamaica, a journey that would put it through the rigors of a long sea voyage. The journey was a resounding success. H4 performed with a stunning accuracy, proving that a clock could indeed be used to determine longitude. At sea, the navigator of the ship, an experienced sailor named Captain William Campbell, was astounded by its performance. He wrote in his log, I cannot say enough in favor of this wonderful instrument. But despite this success, the Board of Longitude, in a shocking act of institutional bias, refused to pay Harrison the full prize. They argued that his success was a fluke, and they demanded that he reveal his methods and build a second, identical watch that would also perform with the same accuracy. Harrison, a man of profound integrity and an unyielding will, was heartbroken but not defeated. He spent the next decade fighting for his due. He built a fifth chronometer and continued to fight the Board of Longitude, which had, by this point, found a new favorite in the astronomer Neville Maskelyne. The board continually moved the goalposts, demanding new trials and new proofs. Harrison's fight became a kind of public spectacle, a David and Goliath story that pitted a single, brilliant craftsman against the full weight of the scientific establishment. The story of John Harrison is a quiet but powerful testament to the triumph of empirical evidence over intellectual dogma. He was a man who, in his own way, forced the world to accept a new reality. He was a man who believed in a single, simple, and elegant solution, and he spent his entire life proving that he was right. But what was the final outcome of his long and arduous battle? Did he ever receive his prize? And what does his story tell us about the nature of scientific progress and the hidden biases that can stand in its way? John Harrison's final victory was a quiet but profound one. After years of fighting the Board of Longitude and the scientific establishment, he finally appealed directly to King George III. The king, a man who had a keen interest in science and technology, was sympathetic to Harrison's plight. He met with Harrison and tested H5, the final and most accurate of his chronometers, himself. The king was so impressed by its performance that he used his royal authority to pressure Parliament into granting Harrison his due. In 1773, a final Act of Parliament awarded Harrison the remaining prize money, in a clear victory for the humble craftsman over the academic elite. It was a long overdue vindication of a lifetime of work. Harrison's victory, however, was not just a personal one. It was a victory for empirical observation over theoretical speculation. He had proven, with his meticulous craftsmanship and his relentless focus on a single problem, that a machine could solve a problem that the greatest minds of the era had believed could only be solved by the stars. His success revolutionized ocean navigation. For the first time, sailors had a reliable way to determine their longitude, making long-distance sea travel safer, faster, and more predictable. This, in turn, had a profound impact on global trade, naval power, and the charting of the world. The clock, a simple instrument of time, became a powerful tool of empire. The story of John Harrison is a quiet but powerful testament to the hidden forces of scientific progress. It reminds us that innovation is not always a linear process, and that the greatest breakthroughs often come from unexpected places and from people who are outside the established intellectual circles. Harrison, the simple craftsman, had a genius that was different from that of the astronomers. He had a genius of the hand and the eye, a genius that was rooted in the practical reality of building a machine that worked. His story is a powerful reminder that both theory and practice are necessary for true progress, and that sometimes it is the quiet, methodical work of a single individual that can change the world. So, as you check your watch or your phone for the time. Remember the man who, in his quiet workshop, spent a lifetime trying to build a perfect machine. His work, his patience, and his unwavering belief in his own genius were the part of the clockwork that made our modern world possible. The year is 1850. The place is Paris, a city known for its beauty, its art, and its intellectual life. But beneath its grand boulevards and its romantic facades lies a darker, more somber reality. The city, like all great metropolises of the past, had a profound and often overlooked problem: its vast and crowded cemeteries. The graveyards of Paris in the mid-19th century were a public health nightmare. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and a source of constant concern for the city's residents. The sheer number of burials in a small amount of space had led to a morbid and unsanitary practice. The city's gravediggers would, in a grim and routine act, exhume old graves to make way for new ones. The bodies, in various states of decay, would be unceremoniously moved to a series of subterranean tunnels, a vast and winding labyrinth of bones and skulls that would later become known as the Catacombs of Paris. But the bones did not just sit in the ground and wait to be exhumed. They were often a source of profit, a raw material for a quiet and macabre industry. The bones of the deceased, once exhumed, were often sold to a class of workers known as the bone scrapers or bone grinders. These men, a forgotten and overlooked part of the Parisian industrial machine, had a grisly but vital job. They would collect the bones from the cemeteries and workshops of the city and would grind them down into a fine white powder. This powder, in a strange and macabre twist of fate, was a highly valuable commodity. The bone powder was used for a variety of purposes. It was an essential ingredient in the production of sugar, acting as a decolorizing agent. It was also used in the creation of bone china, a fine and highly prized form of porcelain, but its most vital use was in the production of fertilizer. The bones, rich in phosphate, were a potent source of nutrients for the soil. The bone scrapers, in their own quiet and grimy way, were a part of the agricultural revolution, a silent link in the food chain that connected the dead of the city to the living in the countryside. The life of a bone scraper was one of immense physical labor and a profound, constant proximity to death. They worked in conditions that were unsanitary and dangerous, breathing in the fine particulate dust of human remains. They were a part of the underbelly of Paris, a forgotten and often reviled part of the urban economy. They were the men who, in their own way, turned death into life, a macabre and necessary part of the cycle of existence. What was it like to live a life surrounded by the bones of the dead? What were the dangers and the quiet indignities of this grisly profession? And what does their story tell us about the hidden, often grotesque, infrastructure that was a part of every great city in the past? The bone scrapers and bone grinders of old Paris were a fundamental, if unseemly, part of the city's economic ecosystem. They operated on the fringes of society, often working in small, rudimentary workshops on the outskirts of the city. The bones, often collected from the vast ossuaries and charnel houses of the city's cemeteries, were sorted by size and condition. The process of grinding was a simple but grueling one, often done with large, hand-cranked mills. The work was dusty and unsanitary, and the bone dust, a fine, almost invisible powder would coat everything. The bone scrapers, in their own way, were a part of the city's hidden infrastructure, a crucial cog in a system that turned death into commerce. The physical and health dangers of this profession were immense and largely unaddressed. The constant exposure to bone dust, which contained a variety of pathogens and bacteria, led to a high incidence of respiratory diseases. The work was also physically demanding, leading to a host of orthopedic problems. But the most profound danger was the psychological one. These men spent their days surrounded by human remains, a constant and morbid reminder of mortality. The job was not just dirty, it was also spiritually and emotionally draining. They were, in a sense, the caretakers of a city's forgotten dead. Men who had to live with the grim reality of what happened to the body after it was laid to rest. The bone scrapers, as a class of people, were also a part of a larger historical trend. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many of the old crowded cemeteries of Europe were being closed down and their contents moved. This process of exhumation was a massive, if largely forgotten, public works project. It was driven by a new, more scientific understanding of sanitation and public health. The old graveyards, which were often located in the heart of cities, were seen as a source of disease and a blight on the urban landscape. The solution was to move the bones to a centralized location, a massive subterranean ossuary. The bone scrapers, in their own way, were a part of this great relocation, a quiet, unsung part of a massive historical undertaking. The most famous of these ossuaries, of course, is the Catacombs of Paris. The catacombs were created in the late 18th century as a solution to the city's overcrowded cemeteries. The bones of millions of Parisians, from the rich to the poor, were exhumed and moved to the catacombs. It was a macabre and monumental task that took years to complete. The bone scrapers, in a strange and beautiful twist of fate, were a part of a much larger, more formal process. They were the men who, in their own way, helped to organize the great collective tomb of a city. The story of the bone scrapers is a quiet but powerful testament to the hidden reality of urban life. It reminds us that every great city has an underbelly, a series of essential and often unpleasant jobs that are necessary to keep the whole machine running. The beauty and art of Paris were built on a foundation of bone and grime. What would be the ultimate fate of this grim profession? How did a changing world and a new understanding of science render the bone scraper obsolete? And what does their story tell us about our modern and often sterilized relationship with death? Section 3. The grim profession of the bone scraper. A necessary part of old Paris's morbid infrastructure was a trade destined for obsolescence. The forces that drove it into the shadows were a combination of public health reform, technological innovation, and a changing societal attitude towards death. The development of modern scientific burial practices and the creation of large suburban cemeteries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries meant that the overcrowded, unsanitary urban graveyards were no longer a source of raw materials. The practice of mass exhumation, once a necessity, was now seen as a violation of human dignity. The bone scraper, a man who worked in the gruesome space between life and death, was an anachronism in a new world that valued cleanliness and order. The most significant factor in the decline of the bone grinding trade was the rise of modern chemistry and agriculture. The use of bones as a fertilizer, a practice that was as old as farming itself, was replaced by the development of chemical fertilizers, particularly superphosphate. These new man-made fertilizers were more potent, more reliable, and did not require the grim and unsanitary process of grinding up human and animal remains. The bone scraper's role, once a vital link in the food chain, was now obsolete. The industry, with its small, rudimentary workshops and its macabre rituals, was simply no match for the scale and efficiency of a new industrial process. The story of the bone scrapers is a powerful and mind-settling reminder of the unseen infrastructure that underpins all of human civilization. It is a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of the most vital functions of a society are performed by people who work in the shadows, doing jobs that we would rather not think about. Their story is a testament to the fact that progress is not always a clean and beautiful thing. It is often built on a foundation of grim and unseemly labor. It also highlights our modern, often sterilized, relationship with death. We no longer see the bodies of the dead, nor do we see the process of their decay. The bone scraper, in his own way, was a living embodiment of that process, a stark reminder of our own mortality. So, the next time you look at a garden or eat a meal, consider the silent and unseen forces that went into its creation. And remember the men who, in their own quiet and morbid way, turned death into life, one bone at a time. The year is 1870. The place is London, a city that, to a Victorian observer, was a constant, bewildering rush of new things. Among the most curious and captivating of these new things was the penny farthing, a bicycle of such unusual design that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The design of the penny farthing was a direct result of the limitations of the technology of the time. The bicycle, in its earlier incarnations, was a cumbersome, foot-powered contraption with no pedals. The addition of pedals to the front wheel was a brilliant innovation, but it created a new problem. In order to go faster, the rider had to pedal faster. The only way to increase speed without increasing the rate of pedaling was to increase the size of the wheel. The larger the wheel, the farther the bicycle would travel with each rotation of the pedals. The result was the penny farthing, a machine that was a direct and logical consequence of the drive for efficiency and speed. The penny farthing was a sensation. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a machine that was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. It was faster than any horse-drawn carriage and more agile than any four-wheeled vehicle. It was a machine that gave its rider a profound sense of speed and freedom. But it was also a machine that was incredibly dangerous. The rider, perched high above the ground, was in a precarious position. A single stone in the road, a sudden jolt, or a missed turn could send the rider flying headfirst over the handlebars. This was a phenomenon known as taking a header, and it was a constant and terrifying risk for every rider. The penny farthing, in its own way, was a microcosm of the Victorian era. It was a symbol of an age that was simultaneously confident and reckless, an age that was willing to take a great risk in the name of progress. The high-wheeled bicycle, with its inherent danger, was a perfect reflection of a world that was moving faster than it had ever moved before. But the penny farthing was more than just a dangerous toy. It was also a tool for social change. It was a vehicle that gave its rider a new sense of mobility and independence, a sense that was particularly important for women who were often confined to their homes. But what was the daily reality of riding a penny farthing? What were the challenges and the quiet triumphs of a rider's life? And what does the quiet, forgotten story of this machine tell us about the nature of technological progress? The daily reality of riding a penny farthing was one of constant vigilance and quiet triumph. The rider, perched high above the ground, had an unparalleled view of the street, but this advantage came with a steep price. The bicycle had no brakes to speak of. The rider had to use back pressure on the pedals to slow down, a technique that required a great deal of skill and strength. A sudden stop was almost impossible. The rider also had to contend with the primitive and often treacherous streets of the Victorian era. The roads were filled with horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians, and, most importantly, with cobblestones and potholes that could send the rider flying. The sheer height of the bicycle made it a perilous undertaking, and a crash, or taking a header, was a common and often very painful occurrence. Despite these dangers, the penny farthing found a dedicated and passionate following. It was more than just a means of transport. It was a sport and a source of community. Cycling clubs, known as bicycle clubs, sprang up across Europe and America. These clubs were a place for like-minded individuals to share their love of the machine, to organize races, and to go on long, leisurely rides into the countryside. The penny farthing, in its own way, was a social leveler. It gave its rider a new sense of freedom and mobility, a sense that was particularly important for women. The bicycle, with its inherent sense of independence, was a quiet but powerful tool for women's emancipation. A woman on a penny farthing was a woman who was not confined to her home, who could travel at her own will, and who was, in her own way, a symbol of a new kind of freedom. The penny farthing, in its quiet way, also helped to lay the groundwork for a new kind of urban infrastructure. The rise of the bicycle created a new and urgent need for better roads. The cobblestone streets, which were a constant danger to the high-wheeled bicycle, were a clear and obvious problem. The cycling clubs and their riders became powerful advocates for road reform. They lobbied their governments to pave the roads, to build dedicated cycling paths, and to make the streets safer for all who used them. The bicycle, in its own way, helped to pave the way for the age of the automobile. But the reign of the penny farthing was a short one. It was, in its own way, an evolutionary dead end. The flaws in its design, its inherent instability, and its constant danger were simply too great to overcome. The solution to the bicycle's problems would come not from a taller wheel, but from a smaller and much safer one. The invention of the chain-driven bicycle with two wheels of equal size, known as the safety bicycle, would render the penny farthing obsolete almost overnight. The safety bicycle was faster, more stable, and, most importantly, safer. It was a machine that was accessible to everyone, not just the daredevils and the physically fit. The story of the penny farthing is a quiet but powerful testament to the nature of technological progress. It was a machine that was brilliant in its own way, a perfect response to the problems of its time. But it was also a machine that was fundamentally flawed, a design that would be quickly surpassed by a new and more elegant solution. the final fate of this strange and beautiful machine. And what does its short but fascinating history tell us about the hidden costs of innovation and the human drive for progress?